All right, we're back, lecture 3. As I have talked with my colleagues and other emerging adults about the characteristics of emerging adulthood and all that comes with that, there is a little bit of pushback that our net has gotten, and I have experienced as we've talked about these experiences, that there's a cultural lens that we have to keep in mind as we think about these characteristics. If we're not careful, we can superimpose characteristics and not really think about race, ethnicity, cultural backgrounds, family systems, and all that comes with that. And so what's been beautiful about emerging adult research that has now only been around for about 20, 25 years is that many researchers are beginning to expand the work and trying to make it more particular to different backgrounds and cultures associated with emerging adulthood. And this is really, really important because I think it gives us a much more rich description of what is going on. And so I want to take a minute to talk about that a little bit, to expand and maybe nuance the last lecture a little bit more. And so I want to start by doing that by reading a quote by Syed and Mitchell, and you'll read one of their articles this week, and I have some more in the recommended reading as well. And they say this. They said, emerging adulthood is the age of instability, possibilities, self-focus, feeling in between, and identity exploration. Remember, Arnett talked about that, right? So they're referencing Arnett right now, and so we're kind of catching up on the literature. But for whom? Whose experiences fall under the rubric of emerging adulthood? Really, really important question. And this is what they begin to explore. Now, what I think that they do that is really helpful is they make a distinction between emerging adulthood and emerging adults. Okay, emerging adulthood is this. It's a term akin to infancy, childhood, and adolescence. Notice it's sort of a developmental theme, all of which are labels to describe a portion of the lifespan that are defined by some shared social and psychological experiences. Okay, so generally speaking, emerging adulthood is 18 to 30. Okay, this is sort of the period by which generally one who is an emerging adult would fall under for us to understand emerging adulthood. And so emerging adults, though, is a label that applies to individuals themselves, those who are actively immersed in the social and psychological experiences of emerging adulthood. Now, I think this distinction is really, really important because the last thing that we want to do now is at the end of this lecture to go around and look for people in their 20s and be like, you're an emerging adult. Hey, look at the emerging adult. What do you think about being an emerging adult, right? That probably would be problematic because what we're doing is we're using a term to somehow label another person. And I think a better way for us to think about it is that there could be people in their 20s that fall under the realm or the age span of emerging adulthood. But it's up to the individual to identify themselves as to whether or not they are an emerging adult. Some in their 20s are going to identify themselves as an adult. They feel like they've achieved what they wanted to, and they see themselves as an adult. Others are still working on their way there, and perhaps the descriptions that we've talked about here give them language to articulate that I don't feel like quite an adult yet, but I'm working my way there. You see the difference? So we can talk about emerging adulthood as a term, but what we want to do is we want to invite people to consider whether or not they choose to identify as an emerging adult. And let me just stop and go meta on you for a second and explore this, that some of you in this class who are in your 20s may find emerging adulthood a great term that gives language to your experiences. And others of you are like, no, maybe not so much. Maybe I already feel like an adult, or I'm sort of moving beyond some of these questions or characteristics that we've talked about. Either one is okay, but that's how we want to think about and use these terms. Now, when it comes to the five main features, Syed and Mitchell began to say, well, as we think about race and ethnicity, is there any way we want to turn this and take into account some nuance that perhaps Arnett doesn't develop enough in his general definitions? And so we know that when it comes to identity exploration, they suggest that the collective research on ethnic identity during emerging adulthood indicates that this is a domain of identity that is very much at play and far from complete following adolescence. So there's something significant about thinking about one's definition or self-identification as identity when they think about their own race and ethnicity associated with that. And so what they say then is, considering the centrality of identity to emerging adulthood, this is a pressing need for such research. So they're saying we want more research on the unique challenges associated with the backgrounds of race and ethnicity as we think about emerging adulthood, which I think is really, really crucial. And hopefully you'll see this reflected in some of the articles that I have for you in this class. When it comes to instability, they suggest that the degree to which instability is similarly experienced across racial and ethnic lines is not clear. And I think they make a great point. Instability looks quite different, probably depending on whether or not you are privileged or not, or what privileges that you have. And I think it's important for us to keep that in mind. And so they go on to say, existing research on family conflicts suggests greater prevalence, variability, and links to negative outcomes for ethnic minorities compared to whites. So there could be a lot of reasons for this, right? The family makeup, as we think about more of an individualistic or collectivistic perspective or background, all these have some factors that play into the ways that instability might be felt or experienced that we need to pay attention to. Thirdly, when we think about this idea of self-focus, I think too often it can go, according to them, go to this idea of independence versus, say, interdependence. Which is really, really important. When we think about self-focusedness, we can't only think about how we sort of become ourselves. In a lot of backgrounds and cultures, one can't just think about themselves. They always are thinking about themselves in light of their relationship to and responsibility for their community, which is deeply important in their identity and their responsibilities. And so Sayed and Mitchell say future researchers should consider adopting a more dynamic view that considers the role of local, developmental, and political historical contexts, as well as we think about this idea of what it means to focus on the self and understand one's self. When it comes to this idea of feeling in between. This is the age of feeling in between is a topic that is in need of greater research with both minority and majority samples. And this is where our current FYI research resides. We're taking that quite seriously as we think about our work with teenagers and also the work that I'm doing with emerging adults, of recognizing the fact that we need a broad and diverse sample as we think about what this in-betweenness looks like, feels like, and how it is experienced, so that we can tell the stories of emerging adults in a helpful way. And then I think there's this idea of unparalleled possibilities. And again, I think this comes down to, as Sayed Mitchell talks about, the fact that unparalleled possibilities is not equal across the board. And we have to keep this in mind. And maybe one of the things that they bring up, which I think is really, really crucial, is perhaps maybe more under-resourced individuals that fall into the camp of emerging adulthood actually demonstrate not only unparalleled possibility, but also this sense of resilience to actually demonstrate and show and model and inspire that even when they may have less privilege and there are more hurdles of which they need to clear, that they find a way to be resilient and lean into these possibilities. And so I think there's a lot of hope associated with what they're thinking about here as well. Mary Kate Blake says this. She says, emerging adults provide a window into understanding conceptual fluidity in different dimensions of race and ethnicity for all age groups, because of the heightened experience providing a bridge between the racial identity research on adolescents and adults. So emerging adulthood is this remarkable space where we have so much to learn, but perhaps we have so much to discover as those in their 20s are negotiating and moving away from adolescence and are approaching adulthood and trying to make sense of their lives in a world where the scripts are not as defined and they are having to do the work of becoming. And so I think there's something quite remarkable about this space of emerging adulthood that we get as sort of have a privilege of seeking to understand, so that we can understand the stories of emerging adults. So in light of these characteristics, here's a question that I think we just have to keep asking ourselves. Like, what's good news to an emerging adult? And more specifically, what's good news to an emerging adult you know? Think about your context. Think about the relationships that you have and the connections you have with emerging adults. As you think about these characteristics, What is unique to the emerging adults that you know, and how might these characteristics provide maybe some lenses for you to probe a little bit deeper, to have empathy, to understand who they are and where they are coming from? I hope this was helpful. I hope in these last three lectures I've given you a chance to turn and understand emerging adulthood just a little bit more. This understanding of it is going to build a foundation for us to build on as we continue to think about what it means to show up and attend to emerging adults where they say they need us the most. Grace, peace.